Okay, so let's get going. People can join as they come along. So welcome everyone. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Bendigo people that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past, present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. Welcome to the 13th edition of CFRC's seminar series. Hope everyone's doing well. And it looks like New South Wales is very close to 80% full vaccination. It's like we are at like 77 as of yesterday, I think. And I'm looking forward to further ease of restrictions with that. There have been more good news recently with international travel, and it's like with the more news coming in, like it's hard not to be positive. So that being said, like so today's seminar is by Dr. Chris Martin. He's a senior research fellow with City Futures. His qualifications are in economics, law, and criminology. Chris specializes in housing research, including rental housing law, social housing policy, and in areas intersection between housing and criminal justice system, and has a long involvement with housing advocacy organizations. Today, he will be speaking about housing after prison for people with complex support needs. I'm looking forward to the talk, and over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Bala. I'll try to take over the screen now. Am I coming through properly?
Yep, can see it good.
Good. Well, thanks for joining me. This is a presentation of some recent research I was involved in, sponsored by Ahuri, on housing after prison for people with complex support needs. I'll acknowledge that I'm on unceded Dharawal country today, and I pay my respects to the Dharawal Nation, their elders past and present. Quick outline of what I hope to cover in the presentation, a bit on the research project itself, what I'll call the homelessness-imprisonment connection, the policy context for this connection. I'll also talk about post-release pathways, what we heard in the research project from the people we spoke with. Also, the results of a quantitative analysis of linked data about post-release pathways, and some case studies also from that linked data. So the research project was published a couple of months ago now by Ahuri. It's part of a wider inquiry, as Ahuri does, into housing on leaving certain institutional settings. This one's on prison. There's also ones on residential rehab, and one just out last week, I think, on out-of-home care for younger people. In our project, we looked at some linked data, quantitative analysis of linked data. We did interviews with a lot of stakeholders, and we did reviews of policy and published stats. We had a focus on New South Wales, Victoria, and Tasmania in particular, reflecting where all the members of this research team are from. So at the core of this project is what we're calling the housing imprisonment connection. And this is something that will be really familiar to practitioners in particular, but I think most people have a sense that these that homelessness and imprisonment are closely connected. We estimated, looking through the research, we estimated about in Australia about 65,000 exits from prison occur every year, and the classic metaphor for exiting prison is going home, but actually most people exiting prison either expect to be homeless or don't know where they'll be living. on the other side of the connection, on going into prison, about 33% of people going into prison have been previously homeless. Some previous research on this connection, Eileen Baldry, one of the team members from UNSW in a landmark research project 20 years ago now, found unstable housing is one of the two big predictors of reincarceration for people after prison. People in unstable housing reincarcerated at 3 times the rate of others. Also, some more recent research looking at the other side of it. Homelessness, prior imprisonment predicts homelessness. This is what's been found from the big Journeys Home research project out in Melbourne. So reflecting this established connection, homelessness, ex-prisoners are a priority group in some of the state homelessness strategies. No exits into homelessness is an objective of those strategies. We also see, as those charts on the screen there show, ex-prisoners are they're the fastest growing client group, have been for about a decade now, the fastest growing client group for specialist homelessness services. Those graphs show their numbers going up. So we'll a little on the wider policy context. Imprisonment in Australia is rising. Again, that's it's shown in the charts there, except for the COVID year we've just had, when entries into prison went down quite a lot. Rates of imprisonment, numbers in prison, and also rates of population in prison have been going up for the last decade. Interestingly, states have they do have some objectives around reducing recidivism, returns to prison, but not imprisonment rates themselves. They don't go there with their premier's priorities and other headline objectives. When we look at the published stats about prisons, they are big aggregators of disadvantage, and I've given a couple of examples relevant to the cohort we looked in this study. Really disproportionate rates of mental health conditions, illicit drug use, disability. Also, and this is not being glib about it, but also we can say 100% of people who have been in prison have been in a inherently afflictive and harmful institutional context, and that's a bit of they're not just aggregators of disadvantage. Prisons do harm in and of themselves. The wider context in homelessness. So over the last 10 years or so, homelessness policy has really been beset by uncertainty, and we saw in particularly around the time of the Rudd government a real priority given to homelessness and things like the Road Home, the National Partnership Against Homelessness, Housing First as a model of assisting people experiencing homelessness. That impetus was fairly quickly lost, though, with doubts around the continued funding, particularly particularly under the Abbott government and subsequent governments, doubts about funding. That funding has in fact continued, but it's been a much more uncertain context for that sector. Some return to state level priority lately. That's particularly around rough sleeping, though. In relation to social housing, the social housing policy context has been one of decline, and that's the graph there that shows real per capita expenditure on social housing. That it's been on a starvation ration for decades, and it's been slowly declining ever since. Contrast that with imprisonment rates per capita, as we saw in a couple of slides ago. In the latest pandemic stimulus responses, there's been no stimulus from the Commonwealth for social housing. There has been for Victoria, but they're the bottom line in that chart there. And so their stimulus is for a sector that has had the lowest base spending of all the jurisdictions in Australia. Couple of final bits of context. Disability policy. This is something that has reformed in a big and quite fundamental way with the NDIS and person-centred funding. It's also meant that some state services that operated in this homelessness imprisonment connection space have been retrenched alongside the wider state disability services. The NDIS has acknowledged that there are barriers to access, particularly for people who have been in contact with the criminal justice system. They do have some new officers that are supposed to that are intended to open up those pathways of access. Finally, I'll mention the specific sector, the transitional or reintegration sector that specifically works with people exiting prison and reintegrating with the community. In terms of the accommodation it provides, it is tiny. So for example, in New South Wales, it's fewer than 100 beds in the whole state, whereas we have nearly 20,000 prison exits every year. It's also a sector that experiences a lot of program churns, lots of pilots that start up and stop, and then there's something else again. We are moving on to the to what we heard from stakeholders in the sector, and that includes a small group of ex-prisoners with whom we spoke in interviews for the research. So these were people, ex-prisoners, housing workers, corrective services workers, community housing, reintegration workers, disability support workers. Unanimously, they said there is a dearth of accommodation options for people coming out of prison, and that was the unanimous frustration that all of these people expressed. We heard about the reality of working in that pre-release period and the heavy workloads that corrective services officers have, and also non-government reintegration workers have. Those, as I said, there's a really small sector of transitional accommodation provided under specific programs funded by corrective services. That's really tightly rationed, and when they're planning corrective services, make sure to ration allocation to those services to the very most difficult cases. So for everyone else, really planning is often really last minute, because there's nothing to plan with, and often doesn't happen until very shortly before release. And that might be as much as a referral to housing, the public housing or the central housing register, and their emergency accommodation service. I've included a quote there from a housing officer who spoke about what can be done in this pre-release planning stage, and I used his quote in some of my other interviews as a bit of a provocation to the other stakeholders I spoke to, because he said, and it was controversial, he said, pre-planning. If we did more of it, would we get anything out of it? No, I don't think we would. In fact, he referred to a pilot where they didn't get anything out of it. And a lot of the reintegration workers I spoke to took issue with that. They said, and it's a credit to them because they sort of felt like there's always something more that we could do around pre-planning, and there's, you know, people want to get this stuff sorted, and the prisoners, when we speak to prisoners, they want to, they're taking in a lot of information. They want to plan for their release. But I give credit to the housing officer who said that we don't have anything to plan with. If we did have some real options, it might be a different story. But as it is, you're not getting any extra benefit out of it, because you might as well leave it to the last week, because it's just going to be a referral to their emergency referral service. So coming out of prison, we heard about people on a really fraught pathway between various forms of temporary accommodation. And so that emergency accommodation that they might be set up with on their first presentation at the housing office might be a motel. In some areas, it could be a caravan park. If they're lucky, it might be a specialist homelessness service, and it might be boarding houses. It was emphasised to us in the interviews just how stressful this pathway can be, and especially that first the first day and the first period after release. It's a time of really high anxiety, and the sort of temporary accommodation, TA, as I've called it there, temporary accommodation provided, and the terms on which it's provided, of having to go back every couple of days and reapply to stay in the motel where you are, and you don't know where you might be after that. Really highly stressful, and it interferes with the delivery of other services and supports that these reintegration services might be trying to provide a person. So we heard from for example, an alcohol and other drug specialist, a drug counsellor, who said that he and his team find that they're doing housing crisis support and not getting to the drug and alcohol counselling that they're supposed to be doing with people because they're dealing with housing situations. When we speaking with these stakeholders, these workers, and also with the ex-prisoners, we talked about also the long-term prospects for housing, and social housing kept coming up as the optimal response. Private rental was seen as that there are some real barriers to private rental. Some of the prisoners we spoke to said that they'd be quite happy with a private rental, but the sorts of things they were looking for in private rental, like I want to be able to, stop moving around and put my roots down and things like that, hard to get from private rental. And the affordable, the low cost end of the private rental market is super competitive too. So social housing is really the optimal option for as many people saw it. And in terms of providing affordability and security that you can't get in private rental, and space for personal fulfillment, and also for engaging with those other support services that might be necessary to really ensuring a person's reintegration, or their best shot at reintegration. Onto the linked data analysis. At UNSW, Eileen Baldry some time ago assembled this data bank, the MHDCD data bank, the mental health disorder and cognitive disorder data bank, a linked data bank of about 2,700 people who've been in prison in New South Wales for a period between 2000 and 2008. Most of them have a mental health condition or cognitive disability, and that data bank includes data from before their time in prison and afterwards from a range of New South Wales government agencies, police, corrective services, DCJ, so it includes data about housing. We conducted we conducted a comparative interrupted time series analysis, which, when I say we, I mean my economist colleague, especially Rebecca Reeve from UNSW, who really deserves the credit for what we were able to do with the quantitative analysis, and also a cost benefit analysis on the compared experiences, the compared post-release pathways of two groups. So we're able to take from this data bank one group who received public housing at some point after an exit from prison. There's about 600 of those, and also fortuitously a similar number of people who were eligible for public housing but who didn't get it and who instead got only some sort of private rental assistance, so a bond loan or something like that. And we also did some subgroup analysis by gender, Indigenous status, complexity of diagnoses, and age. Those comparison groups, they, as I said, on a few measures we checked and that they are comparable. They're comparable groups. As you'll see in the charts that I show in a moment, you can start to see a little bit of difference between the groups, which we can talk about towards the end. But they are, as I say, both of them eligible for public housing. One group got it, one didn't. So in summary, what we found after public housing, that group that got public housing, their police incidents went down about on average 9% per annum per year, 9% per annum. Court appearances also down, proven offences also down, time in custody. These are all of the criminal justice measures, outcome measures that we looked at after public housing. There's this significant trend down for that group. Justice costs on average down $5,000 in the first year and $2,000 after that. And it was a similar story for each of those subgroups that we looked at, and also as when we looked at age, each extra year of age meant a little bit more of an improvement as well. So another, I've got some slides of this that really quite graphically show that impact of public housing on all of those measures for the public housing group. Now, we also did a cost benefit analysis. So all of those improvements in criminal justice outcomes, we can put a cost on that by using average cost of crime data. We can, and taking into account the cost of providing public housing versus the costs that might be associated with either being in private rental or in a specialist homelessness service, if we're assuming that's where people end up to. And when we look at when we take all of those different costs into account, the public housing tenancy, it comes out better in terms of costs between $5,000 and $35,000, depending on whether you're comparing against private rental or a homelessness service. Another thing about this group, on average, they waited 5 years for public housing, and if they were getting in sooner, you'd expect to have an even greater cost benefit. So here are Rebecca's. I think these are, they're worth more than the usual 1,000 words. They're a really striking depiction of the difference public housing makes. So I'll just explain. If you look at the left-hand side of the screen, it's a pair of charts top and bottom, they're on the left-hand side. These are this pair is about police incidents per annum. The top chart shows police incidents for the private rental assistance only group. The bottom is for our public housing group. So over time, over the period for which we have data from the data bank, we see that group that didn't get public housing, their police incidents have drifted up over the years. We also see, looking at the public housing group, that their incidents are also rising over the years to year zero, and year zero is where this group gets public housing, and thereafter it's dramatic. A public housing turns around their trend and police incidents decline. So and so on. On the right hand side, we've got court appearances per annum. So you know that the private rental assistance group has trending down over the years, but still, even at the end, on average, they're going to court once every 2 years. For the public housing group, they're actually not trending down until they get public housing, and then it makes quite a dramatic difference to their court appearances. And similar things here for proven offences per annum, for numbers of days in custody, where we see this public housing group they're really on quite a rise, unlike the private rentals group, which was trending down. But then when they get public housing, it really knocks their days in custody right down. And over a longer term, it keeps going down. That's the trend. So this is that qualification I raised before, which is that, as you can see, in that period before public housing, before year zero, there are some differences in the trends going on, which I think suggests that, to the credit of the social housing system, it is picking up where people are. You know, this is their priority. Their prioritization of applications is having an effect, and they're prioritizing people who are going off the rails. So there is that. This is part of the story as well, but I think that the bigger part of it is just how big a difference public housing makes afterwards. And a couple more. That's supervised community orders, so orders in the community, non-custodial sanctions, and justice costs on the other side there. We did a couple of case studies as well from the data bank. We were able to pull out the data is de-identified, so we're able to pull out some cases. And we've named two. We've named them here. There's Jason. Jason's one of the positive stories that suggested by those charts. He's a guy who, in his late teens, he's committing increasingly violent offences against women, and he's spending time in jail. And then fairly early on, he gets a public housing tenancy, and there's a dramatic reduction in his contact with police. He doesn't go back. He doesn't go back to jail. There's no other offences. He's also he gets on. Let's see. He gets DSP. He finds a partner. It's a story of a guy who really settles down. There's another interesting aspect of the story is it also illustrates a thing that public housing in particular can do, and that is about transfers. So the only other times he pops up later in police records is when there's a time when there's a you can see a neighbourhood dispute happening, and there's some people have egged his house and a couple of things like that. And public housing is able to head that off, and his housing officer gets a transfer. He and his partner transfer to another tenancy, and he stays out of trouble. So that's he really illustrates, and you can see it in his. We've got here some of his cost data and how much in the blue pie charts, which are at a scale, he's incurring a whole lot of justice system costs there. In his early 20s, a lot of justice system costs because he's spending even more time in jail and committing some serious offences. Then housing kicks in. Housing starts to represent more of his costs, but the total cost to government goes right down because he's really not in contact with the justice system anymore. Our other case study is an unhappy case, and this is Deborah. So she actually, a bit unusually, she appears in police data and corrective services data for the first time in her mid-30s, rather later in life than a lot of people, and it's mostly around conflict with her next partner. There's AVOs, and she breaches the AVO, and she ends up spending a bit of time in prison, and she has a couple of public housing tenancies. There's hospital admissions as well for mental health admissions to hospital. She's on she goes through a series of tenancies and a series of prison terms. On the one hand, this case looks like a case of a person getting numerous chances, and that'll be familiar to people who deal with public housing officers. The idea that a person, they've had so many chances. I think properly, this is also a case of how many chances state agencies had to properly support a person who was very lately diagnosed with significant mental health problems and cognitive disabilities. These were only picked up after she had been in prison numerous times, an experience of childhood abuse and trauma, and she's had no support from any disability support services. Even having spent a time in prison and public housing tenancies as well. So an example of the need to continue to also to support the delivery of support and some of the complicated situations in which support has to be delivered, and the complications of state government agencies responding in a cohesive way to people. So the conclusion, I think, across all of this, we think the evidence suggests that, more than suggests, it really strongly shows that much greater provision of social housing to people exiting prison would make a big difference to their criminal justice outcomes, to the safety of the community, and to the costs that government agencies and non-government agencies incur in dealing with people, either through criminal justice agencies or through other more supportive agencies. And we think the evidence shows that public housing in particular is a relatively secure and affordable and steady hook for change, to use some of the language from the literature around desistance from offending. It's something where people can hold on to a stable place and make other changes in their circumstances and in themselves, and that may to engage with other services and to reintegrate in the community. I'll leave it there, and I'll go over to questions now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was a really interesting presentation, and I would like to open the floor for questions. Yeah, so while we wait for the questions, I'll start the discussion with thought of my own. So, what's your opinion on like the conditions of the prison system itself? Like how investing in that, like how the prison in itself is like very restricted, but like still public housing. So so what's your opinion on like working on that side of public housing? So for example, like I'm thinking from systems like Norway and like Scandinavian countries, like we know, like we have seen that like the prison system itself is it resembles what a public housing would be.
I think the priority has to be investing in social housing.
Okay.
Not prisons. I mean, and I mean that's really the point of the research, is that invest in public housing and you don't have to imprison people. People won't go to prison quite so much as they would. And in terms of, I mean, prisons are I think this research also goes to show that prisons are, not just this research, but lots of other studies as well. Prisons are harmful places, and they make people homeless. So it's a place where you take so many people who have been homeless and treat them in a way that is harmful and awful and damaging, and make them homeless again. And really, the priority of governments has got to be on investing in public housing that, as I say, it is a place where people who are getting into trouble can start to find ways in themselves and in other agencies to go right.
Yeah, totally agree. Thanks. So we have a few questions. First, I would go with Chris. You're on screen. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Great presentation. And yeah, very powerful impact, the research that you've conducted there, showing the benefits of social housing. I'm just wondering, I don't know if I missed it, but are there any sort of findings or recommendations or anything coming out of the interviews about all the quantitative analysis about sort of what sort of, is there particular social housing stock that will result, I guess, in even better benefits than you know, just you know, rather than just the binary, yes, social housing, or not.
We didn't get into that in the linked data analysis, and in fact, I should clarify something, and it's in the paper and in the terminology I've used, but we've looked at that linked data analysis looked at public housing and not community housing. So the reason for that is that we couldn't pick where a person had been, where a person got a community housing tenancy in that data bank. So it may be that there are people in that, what we've called the private rental assistance only group, who did in fact get a community housing tenancy at some point. There wouldn't be very many of them because community housing isn't that big, but even so, there'd be people in that comparison group who. So that's something to keep in mind. So the public housing group is really public housing. So this, in a way, this tells a good news story about public housing in particular. The research team see no reason why community housing wouldn't do the same sorts of things or realise the same sorts of benefits for people if it provided tenancies on equivalent terms like security and affordability, and they mostly do, but there are some differences. So that's one qualification. Yeah, this was but we couldn't pick up, even when we looked at public housing, we weren't picking up where properties are in a big estate or where they're dispersed, which is relevant. That is something that came up in the interviews with reintegration workers, and they were, you know, they spoke about clients who got a social housing, public housing allocation, and they were anxious for their clients about the situation they were getting into. But on the other hand, they also said they were also comparing it to someone who is bumping around the boarding house sector and motels for a few nights and not knowing what else, and sleeping on couches and in cars, and social, and the general rule was always social housing's better than that.
Much better.
Yeah, and absolutely the thing that people would be going for.
Well, with the economics there, hopefully, yeah, they get some traction to support, further investment in social housing. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks. And so we have like quite a few questions to go. Next one, Tina. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. Just have a question. Have you considered like community opposition to such developments? Because as I understand, the community in a lot of council areas are quite against boarding houses, that they're worried about what kind of residents might be living in there, let alone social housing or social housing for people that were just out of prison.
Yeah, you're right. In fact, there's some City Futures Research Centre research on that topic from a couple of years ago, particularly on that point, that yeah, this is something that people, that local residents do feel anxious about, and there's often pressure put on local governments. In a way, local governments, well, in a way, the planning system hasn't done itself a whole lot of, well, it's tried to do itself favours and may not have done itself favours, in that there are provisions in our planning system for social housing to go ahead with developments that are outside the normal rules, which sort of gets the fact that they've done that because of opposition, but it also probably invites more opposition, more resentment. And it raises some questions about how different, just in terms of built form, and how different social housing might begin to be if we're planning it differently. On the other hand, though, I think this sort of evidence can what we're seeing here is evidence that building social housing makes communities safer, and I think that, I mean, if it's not being built, if the sort of NIMBY objection is listened to and gets its way, then what we're showing is that there's a cost to that. There's a cost in terms of people going back to prison and members of the community being victimised by crime. So I'd hope this sort of evidence can be put against those sorts of objections too, and used in that way.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks. Next question is from Catherine Dwyer.
Hi, Chris. Thanks very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I'm curious to know, you really talked about the importance of support. So I'm wondering if through your research you got a bit of an indication. I know it's really hard because people are so different, but did you get a bit of an indication of how much support, for how long support is needed to really get people settled into that not just the housing, but their community and their support networks.
Yeah.
I'm particularly coming from a drug and alcohol perspective.
Yeah, only briefly in the interviews did we get into that. So, but I mentioned those little transitional programs, and that tiny sector of transitional accommodation that's out there, and it's often the terms of that are 3 months, sometimes 6 months, and a few of them, only a very few of them, are longer than that. And the reintegration workers we spoke with, yeah, they were they'd say, that's good, but we need, people ideally should have longer and a longer time frame to it. So I mean, that's an issue around those transitional services. I guess there is people do move about, and people will want to make changes and not know exactly where they want to go, and make plans and move on. And I think that sort of thing comes up a little in Jason, like in that case with Jason, where even though private rental is supposed to be all about choice and everything, social housing, if the system had a lot more capacity, could also accommodate that in a way and allow people to make choices and transfer and still have the assurance of an affordable tenancy that's secure on their terms. So I think that's I think that's an important thing that social housing can do too.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine. Next, we have Bill.
Hi, Chris.
Hello, Bill.
How are you? Everything all right? Yeah, look, really interesting presentation and really detailed case study work, which really forensically to understand the dynamics of those individuals, which is really the only way you can understand these sorts of things. I'm interested in the finances and the numbers you put up, which you didn't kind of dwell on very much actually. And the kind of basic question is there any way you can scale those estimates up to give some idea of the cost benefit of public housing in these contexts? I say that because for a long time people have been trying to work out the sort of cost benefits of social housing, going back 20 odd years. I remember some Judy Stubbs' work way back in Southwest Sydney, trying to put a dollar figure on why it was worth investing in social and affordable housing. Are you able to do that at all? Because that could be a really, assuming if the numbers are pretty significant.
Yeah, well, there's some dollars.
Part of that. Okay, go on.
There's dollar figures in there, and they're presented on the basis of individuals, so that on an individual basis for an average cost for an individual. So it's we found it was that on average, the person in public housing, the person coming out of prison who gets public housing, there's a benefit of $5,000, like when you count up all the cost of crime stuff and the cost of providing the public housing, relative to the person who's in private rental, who's doing not so well on the cost of crime stuff, but is getting this cheaper form of assistance from government. So so $5,000 benefit comparing those two average persons.
Is that annual or weekly or?
Annual, yes,
Annual.
that was annual. And if the person is spending if they spend a year in a specialist homelessness service, then it's $35,000 the difference comparing their outcomes. If you're asking about how can you multiply that number by the number of people coming out of prison who get a social housing allocation, we haven't done that because we don't know. We can't tell how many people are leaving prison or we can't tell how many people currently in social housing have been in prison, and we can't tell how many people leaving public housing, leaving prison do get social housing. So presenting it on that, we present it on that individual basis. Yeah, hope that answers it.
Yeah. Well, there's more research to be done then. That's the obviously. Thanks.
So thanks very much, Bill. So we have our final two questions. So one from Alessandra.
Hi, Chris. That was a great presentation. First of all, I had a more of a just a basic question. I was wondering if you noticed any trends between, because I know that male men are more likely to be incarcerated. They grievously overrepresent the prison population. If you notice any difference between women who were like rates of homelessness amongst female ex-prisoners versus rates of homelessness against male prisoners, is that something that came up at all?
That number is in there, but it's not on the top of my head. We did do it's in the second or third chapter, but there's and it's particularly, we did this particularly with just being able to get everywhere, get in one place a review of the published stats around prisons and housing needs of prisoners to the extent that we know them from the published statistics. And so that's in there, and I'm pretty sure there is a breakdown of that number of, when I said it's about 40% of people expect to go to temporary accommodation, and then another proportion of people don't know where they'll go. I think that does get broken down by men and by women.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so there are some things like that in there.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Thanks, Ali. So that brings us to the final 5 minutes of the presentation. Like the talk today, assuming there is not many more questions, so I don't see any. Okay, so that brings us to the conclusion of the seminar. Thank you very much, Chris. That was a very interesting presentation, and it was good to see. So is the report public, which we can?
Yes, it's on Ahuri's website. If you look up exiting prison with complex support needs on the ahuri.edu.au, you'll find it there, and it'll be on the City Futures website as well.
Cool. Thank you very much. Like that would do for a really good weekend read. Yes. And with that being said, thank you very much for everyone for coming to the seminar, and I hope everyone have a great weekend.
Thanks a lot, Bala.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, Chris.
No worries.